Okay, can I have your attention for a second? Because I want to answer something a lot of us have probably wondered about at some point. How long did people actually live back in the ancient world? If you had to guess, you'd probably say not very long. Maybe into your 20s, your 30s if you were lucky. That is not what happened. And the real story, once you actually dig into it, is one of the most fascinating detective stories in all of human history. Because figuring out how long people used to live means digging through skeletons, tax records, tomb inscriptions, genealogies, and yes, actual poison. We're going everywhere today. Paleolithic hunter-gatherers, ancient Egypt, Greece, Rome, Han Dynasty China, medieval Europe, the Aztec world. We're finding out who actually lived the longest, what killed everyone else, what people tried to do about it, and how we went from a species-wide average in the 20s and 30s to the modern world in what is, historically speaking, the blink of an eye. Let's go. First, we need to fix the math, because this is the single most misunderstood statistic in all of history. And once you understand it, everything else in this video is going to click into place. When you hear life expectancy in ancient Rome was 25 years, your brain pictures a world of geriatric 25-year-olds, grandpas with canes, retiring at 22. That is not what the number means. Life expectancy at birth is an average, and averages get absolutely wrecked by extreme numbers on either end. Historians estimate that in ancient Rome, somewhere between 1 in 4 and 1 in 3 infants died before their first birthday. In some demographic models, half of all children were dead before reaching adulthood. Now do the math with me. 10 children, 5 of them die at age 2. The other 5 live to 60. Your average lifespan for that group is 31, but not one single person in that group actually died at 31. Do you see the trick? The number isn't lying to you, but it is being deeply misunderstood by basically everyone, including apparently several AI chatbots that keep confidently informing people that medieval peasants were washed up and elderly by 32. They were not. If a Roman survived to their 20th birthday, they could reasonably expect to live into their 40s, 50s, sometimes their 60s, 70s, even 80s. Cicero's wife, Terentia, reportedly lived to be 103. The Emperor Gordian I became emperor at around 81 years old. So the real question was never how long did ancient people live. The real question the whole time was how many of them survived long enough to find out. So let's go back further than Rome. Let's go all the way back to the beginning. Hunter-gatherers, the original human lifestyle, the one we spent roughly 97% of our entire species' existence living. And here the numbers get genuinely wild. Because researchers studying modern-day foraging populations, groups like the Hadza in Tanzania or the Ache in Paraguay, whose lifestyle closely mirrors our ancestors, found life expectancy at birth hovering somewhere between 20 and 37 years. Rough. But here's the twist nobody expects. Several studies suggest these populations were, in a lot of meaningful ways, healthier than the farmers who came right after them. When humans transitioned to agriculture, something started going wrong. Skeletons from early farming societies show shorter stature, worse teeth, bone lesions from disease, spines wrecked from repetitive labor. The geographer Jared Diamond famously called agriculture the worst mistake in the history of the human race. Harsh, but not entirely wrong. Average male height actually dropped by roughly 5 inches when populations shifted from foraging to early grain-based farming, and it did not fully recover for thousands of years. So that image in your head, ancient humans as short, sickly, and starving, that's less ancient humans in general and more ancient humans after we invented bread and it went badly for a very long while. Okay. Let's get into the actual civilizations, because this is where it gets good. Ancient Egypt. Historians estimate life expectancy at birth somewhere between 19 and 35 years, depending on the period, which, yes, is a suspiciously huge range, and that's because Egyptian data is genuinely messy, pulled from mummies, tomb inscriptions, and skeletal remains spanning 3,000 years of history. But once you strip out infant mortality, the picture changes fast. Egyptians who survived childhood commonly reached their 30s and 40s, with elites, pharaohs, priests, scribes, sometimes pushing into their 50s and 60s. And Egypt shows the class divide in brutal clarity. Tombs of pyramid laborers show men dying around 40 to 45, women around 30 to 35, largely because pregnancy and childbirth were relentlessly dangerous, with zero real medical intervention. Meanwhile, Tutankhamun, an actual pharaoh with the best food, the best care, the best of everything Egypt could offer a human being, still died around age 18, likely from a combination of malaria and a badly broken leg. Status helped, status did not save you from biology. Greece is where things get philosophically messy, because Greek medicine was simultaneously brilliant and unhinged. Hippocrates, the actual father of Western medicine, wrote detailed, genuinely useful observations connecting diet, environment, and disease. Meanwhile, over in Sparta, newborns were reportedly inspected by elders, and sickly infants were, according to ancient sources, sometimes left to die, all in service of producing a population of soldiers. Brutal. Historians actually debate how widespread this practice really was in reality versus in Spartan mythology about itself, but the story Sparta told about its own society was one of ruthless biological selection. Classical-era Greek skeletal remains suggest lifespans improved somewhat compared to earlier Greek periods, likely tied to more stable food supply and denser urban organization. But here's the thread connecting every single ancient society in this video. None of it mattered nearly as much as whether you survived childbirth if you were a woman or survived childhood if you were anyone at all. Now, Rome. Buckle up, because Rome gives us both the most famous number in ancient demography and its most unhinged subplot. Life expectancy at birth in the Roman Empire widely estimated between 25 and 30 years. Infant mortality, over 1 in 3 dying before age 1. By age 5, historians estimate nearly half of all children born had already died, mostly from stomach and intestinal infections in a world with zero concept of germs. But survive to 20, reasonable odds of hitting your 40s or 50s. The class gap in Rome was massive. Wealthy Romans had fine linens, private physicians, and household slaves preparing their food and water. Poor Romans, which was, most Romans, had none of that. And here's the part that sounds like a conspiracy theory, but is a genuinely serious historical debate. Some historians believe Rome's elite may have been quietly poisoning themselves. Wealthy Romans loved a sweetener called sapa, a syrup made by boiling grape juice down in lead pots. The lead reacted with the juice to form lead acetate, literally sugar of lead. Some estimates put the concentration in that syrup at roughly 200 times what we'd consider a safe lead exposure today, and Roman aristocrats put it in almost everything: wine, sauces, preserved fruit. Symptoms of chronic lead poisoning include infertility, cognitive decline, gout, and mood instability, and there's an actual academic argument that lead exposure contributed to erratic behavior in emperors like Caligula and Nero, and to declining birth rates among the Roman aristocracy generally. Is it proven? No, historians still argue about this fiercely, but it is genuinely wild to consider that Rome's elite, the people with access to the best food, water, and doctors in the ancient world, may have been slowly poisoning themselves with their own status symbol. Meanwhile, poor Romans, drinking cheap, unsweetened wine, may have accidentally dodged a bullet their own rulers walked straight into. Let's jump to China, because Han Dynasty China has a genuinely wild statistic buried in it. Some studies of Han-era individuals, using biographical and genealogical records, suggest lifespans that were surprisingly high, in certain analyses averaging over 60, even 70 years, at least among the literate elite whose records happen to survive. Now, sample bias is very real here. We mostly have detailed records for people important enough to write about in the first place. But there's a legal detail that backs up the general trend. Han Dynasty law exempted people over 56 from taxation and labor duties. You don't write laws protecting old people if old people don't exist in meaningful numbers. Traditional Chinese medicine, meanwhile, treated the human body as an interconnected system of balance, tracking diet, herbs, and lifestyle, specifically as tools for longevity, not just as damage control after you got sick. Genuinely forward-thinking. And then, China also gives us one of history's greatest ironies. Emperor Qin Shi Huang, the man who unified China, built the Great Wall, and commissioned an 8,000-statue terracotta army just for his own tomb, spent his final years obsessively hunting for an elixir of immortality. His alchemists gave him pills made of mercury, because mercury was shiny, liquid, and seemed almost magically alive. He took them regularly. He died around age 49, and modern researchers studying his tomb found mercury levels dramatically higher than natural background levels in the surrounding soil. He did not achieve immortality. He achieved the exact opposite, on purpose, repeatedly, for years. And he wasn't even the last emperor to try this. At least 9 more Chinese emperors across nearly 2,000 years of history died the same way, chasing the same shiny poison, chasing the same impossible promise. 10 emperors, same substance, same result, every single time. You'd think somebody eventually would have written that down as a warning label. Medieval Europe, everyone's favorite life was short and miserable era, and look, it wasn't great, but the popular version of this story is more myth than fact. Studies of medieval English landowners found that someone who reached age 25 could expect to live to around 50. Not bad. The real killer, as always, was childhood, plague years aside. And speaking of plague, the Black Death, arriving in 1347, wiped out somewhere between 30 and 50% of England's population in just a few years. Horrific by any measure. But here's a genuinely strange historical footnote. Bioarchaeologists studying London cemeteries found evidence that survivors of the plague years actually lived somewhat longer afterward, likely because population collapse meant more food, better wages, and less competition for whoever was left standing. A silver lining wrapped tightly around an absolute catastrophe. Meanwhile, medieval medicine ran on Galenic theory, inherited from ancient Greece and Rome, the idea that illness came from an imbalance of bodily humors that needed correcting, sometimes through bloodletting, sometimes through herbal remedies. Some of it was nonsense, some of it, especially the herbal treatments, genuinely worked, because plants like chamomile, ginger, and wormwood contain real, measurable compounds. Trial and error, repeated across centuries, quietly produces actual medicine, even when nobody understands why it works yet. Now, let's cross the Atlantic to the Aztec and Maya world, because here the data gets genuinely tragic in how incomplete it is, largely because colonization destroyed enormous portions of the written and oral record. What we do have, mostly from skeletal studies, suggest Aztec life expectancy at birth somewhere from around 25 years up past 40, depending on the study and the region, again dragged down hard by brutal infant mortality. But here's something that should genuinely surprise you. Early Spanish colonizers, arriving with their own European doctors in tow, repeatedly documented a clear preference for Aztec medicine men over their own. Aztec medicine drew on an enormous herbal pharmacy, hundreds documented plants for everything from wound care to fever reduction, alongside genuinely sophisticated surgical and dental practices. This wasn't primitive superstition sitting around waiting for Europe to arrive and fix it. This was an entire parallel medical tradition, developed independently that in several specific areas was outperforming European medicine of that exact century. So here's the question you're probably asking by now. Out of all these civilizations existing at broadly similar points in history, who actually did best? And the honest answer is, it correlates less with how advanced a civilization looked from the outside, and far more with three boring, unglamorous factors: clean water, food security, and population density. Han China, with centralized grain storage systems specifically designed to prevent famine and comparatively lower urban crowding than Rome, appears to have had a genuine edge. The Islamic Golden Age, running roughly from the 8th to the 13th century, deserves a specific mention here too, because physicians like Al-Razi and Ibn Sina were running actual hospitals, some of the first in the world with dedicated wards and formal medical training, and some historians estimate lifespans in that era outperformed contemporary medieval Europe. Rome, by contrast, packed enormous disease-friendly populations into cramped urban housing with genuinely impressive engineering, aqueducts, sewers that still could not outrun the sheer density of people stacked on top of each other. The pattern across every civilization in this video is remarkably consistent. It was never really about how smart or sophisticated a society looked from the outside. It was about whether you could keep people fed, keep the water clean, and keep them from packing into disease-breeding cities faster than sanitation could keep up. Simple, boring, absolutely brutal in its consequences. Which brings us to the actual biggest twist in this entire story. Everything we just covered, Egypt, Greece, Rome, China, medieval Europe, the Aztecs, spans thousands of years. And across all of it, global life expectancy barely moved. It hovered stubbornly somewhere between 20 and 35 years, generation after generation after generation, for essentially the entire span of recorded human civilization. And then, around the year 1800, it started climbing. And it has not stopped since. So what actually happened? It was not one single invention. It was a chain reaction, and it started with an idea that sounds almost embarrassingly simple today. Germs cause disease. Before the mid-1800s, the dominant medical theory was miasma, the belief that disease came from bad-smelling air. Doctors performed surgery without washing their hands, because why would they? There was nothing visible on their hands to wash off as far as anyone knew. Then Louis Pasteur, along with a handful of other scientists, proved that specific, invisible microorganisms were the actual cause of infection. This is germ theory, and it is arguably the single most life-saving idea in human history. Suddenly, hand-washing mattered. Suddenly, boiling water mattered. Suddenly, sterilizing surgical instruments mattered. This triggered what historians call the sanitary revolution, cities building proper sewage systems, separating drinking water from waste for the first time in human history. Then came vaccines, building directly on germ theory, training the immune system to recognize a threat before it could do real damage. Then antibiotics, starting with penicillin in the 20th century, turning infections that had killed people across the entire span of recorded history into a week of mild inconvenience. And then modern obstetric care, sterile delivery rooms, blood transfusions, emergency surgical intervention, finally making childbirth, historically one of the single most dangerous events in any woman's entire life, dramatically safer. And here's the part that should genuinely stop you for a second. In the year 1800, not one single region on planet Earth had a life expectancy above 40 years. Not the wealthiest empire, not the most advanced medical tradition on the planet. None of them. Today, the global average life expectancy sits at roughly 73 years, and in a lot of countries it's closer to 80 or higher. Child mortality tells an even smarter story. For most of human history, something like a third to a half of all children died before reaching adulthood. Today, the global under-5 mortality rate has fallen to under 4%, and in wealthy nations, it's a small fraction of even that. Compress the entire timeline of Homo sapiens into a single day, and essentially all of this progress, everything we just spent this video talking about, happens in the final few seconds. So let's zoom back out. For pretty much the entire span of human civilization, your odds of surviving childhood were genuinely terrifyingly uncertain, no matter which empire you happened to be born into, no matter how advanced that empire looked from the outside. Egypt had its medical papyri, Rome had its aqueducts, China had its herbal formulas and its centralized grain reserves, and none of it, not wealth, not status, not architectural genius, could reliably beat childhood infection or childbirth complications. Not until we finally figured out that invisible organisms, not bad air, not angry gods, not bad luck, were the actual enemy the entire time. We love telling the story of history through emperors and wars and monuments, but the real turning point in how long a human life actually lasted wasn't a battle, and it wasn't a conquest. It was a doctor washing his hands before surgery for what was, historically speaking, basically the first time. That's the story nobody puts in the documentary, and honestly, it's the one that actually changed everything. Thanks for sticking around for this one. If you enjoyed it, a like and a subscribe genuinely helps, and I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments.